All right, welcome back, everyone. It is 10:45, and we have a scheduled presentation from Hemson Consulting with respect to, I gotta find it here, but it's for our asset management plan. And I see we have Christopher, is it Ballette? Is that how you say it? He's
That's
online.
right.
Good morning, Christopher, and I'm gonna turn it right over to you to take us through this update on our asset management plan.
Sounds good. Thank you. Let me just share the screen here 1 second.
Sure.
I believe you should be able to see that. So
We
thanks,
can.
everyone. Good morning, Mayor, members of council. My name is Christopher Ballette, Associate Partner with Hemson Consulting. Just to give you a bit of background, we've worked with the township before back in 2022 in completing the asset management plan kind of back then. This time around, we're working with the township in completing an interim update to meet the 2025 kind of requirements. So I'll walk you through kind of the interim memo that we prepared and some of the findings of that. So kind of a bit of background here. The township has met all of the OREG 580-17 requirements to date, but there is sort of a plan to update the plan fully in 2026. That said, a bit of background. Back in July 1st, 2019, the township did develop a strategic asset management policy as part of meeting the requirements of the regulation, kind of that first piece of that requirement back then. The 22 and 24 requirements really required the township to develop the current level of service or the existing levels of service for both the core and non-core assets. The core assets are really related to your hard infrastructure, so your roads, your bridges, being the hard infrastructure. With the non-core, as the regulation refers to it, are all your other assets, so your vehicles, your equipment, and so on, your facilities, your buildings, as an example. So when we completed that asset management plan, that requirement really met, or that plan really met the requirements of the 2022 and 2024 regulatory pieces, and that was sort of the plan that was completed at that time. Now, moving forward to 2025, there are additional requirements to the regulation. The township is required to develop an asset management plan that kind of identifies and defines the proposed level of service. So the regulation in the province wants municipalities to look at the level of service and identify targets for that level of service for all assets. When I say level of service, however, these are related specifically to infrastructure levels of service. So they're not talking about programming necessarily. They're not talking about any other components of the services that the township provides. They're really related to the performance of the infrastructure, things like condition, maintenance, and so on. So that's really the focus of that requirement. Going forward, there are some post 2025 requirements that the township needs to undertake. Annual progress updates need to be completed before July 1st of 2026 and every year thereafter. They really need to outline, as per the regulation, any challenges in implementing the asset management plan, any mitigation strategies to address those challenges kind of going forward. So that's kind of a requirement. That requirement is very high level. It's up to the township and the discretion of the township of how you want to report on that. But the other piece are 5-year updates. The reg also requires municipalities to update the asset management plan every 5 years post 2025. So the next update would technically be in 2030, although the township might be on a bit of a different schedule just based on that. Just keep in mind that these updates have to be done over the next kind of few years. So what we're doing now here, the township is working with MFOA, the Municipal Finance Officers Association, through the Amp It Up program in order to be able to develop just an interim update. In the meantime, being able to meet the July 1st, 25 requirements. However, there is a plan to update the asset management plan in a more full, wholesome way in order to analyze the proposed level of service in much more detail in 2026. So this is part of a program through the, like I mentioned, through the Amp It Up program to develop this piece here in the interim. One last thing to mention here, in terms of that requirement for 25 was due back in July 1st. So the township is, for all intents and purposes, a little late. However, you are not the only municipality in that situation. The Ministry of Infrastructure has indicated through MFOA that there are several, at least from what our understanding was, at least 150 municipalities who have not completed the 2025 requirement. Not surprising for a variety of reasons, lack of resources, costs, and so on. So, that's sort of something that the province is already aware of, and you're not the only ones in that boat. So just keep that in mind as we look through this. Getting more into the numbers here, the township's asset portfolio is valued at about $106.8 million. So these replacement values are based on the 2022 asset management plan, and had they been inflated to $2025 based on a non-residential construction price index. The 22 AMP replacement value was about 83.4 million. So you can see a significant increase in that replacement value from that time. Not uncommon for many municipalities. We have experienced significant inflation since the time of the pandemic, especially for infrastructure, particularly roads, facilities, vehicles, and given the kind of sort of the economic climate around tariffs and so on, these continue to be the case that infrastructure continues to become more costly. So in terms of the magnitude of the increase here, not surprising, at least to us, as we look at other municipalities as well. In terms of the shares of the infrastructure, very similar to the 22 asset management plan, your buildings and roads making up the lion's share of your asset replacement. A township of your size is really not uncommon to see that, with your vehicles, equipment, other assets, land improvements, and your bridge really making up the balance of that. So the majority of it, more than 3/4, almost 80%, making up the roads, made up by roads and buildings. On the condition side, on average, assets are in good to very good condition. So this is a similar finding in terms of this interim update as the previous asset management plan. Really about 78%, so more than 3/4 of the assets are in good to very good condition. About 12% are in fair condition, about $8.2 million. And then the remainder, about 10%, are in poor or very poor condition. And it's really related to building component or older building components and vehicles, particularly based on age. So a lot of that red and orange you see there may not necessarily be reflective of those particular assets. They may be in better condition than what this would suggest. However, because the information is based on the age of the asset, the older an asset is, it would fall into that bucket. However, overall, this is a pretty good picture for the township in terms of those assets, a lot of them being 3/4 in that green and light green. The roads are not included in that wedge because they are measured a little bit different. The roads overall PCI, back in 2022, when we did the asset management plan, there was a roads needs study that was completed that indicated that the roads were overall around that 78.7 PCI, which would indicate they're about kind of in good condition overall. We recognize that there has been some work done on the road since that time, which potentially might change that PCI, likely for the better. That's not reflected necessarily here because we would need to look at that in more detail. Hopefully, you would do that as part of your 26 update kind of to your asset management plan. However, 78.7 high performance overall on the roads itself. The next slide here is on the key objective here is to define, at least in the interim update here, a proposed level of service. So right now, as part of the 22 asset management plan, we did look at the current level of service. The current level of service was largely based on the condition of the infrastructure. So the maintaining that current level of service, with that, we developed a financing strategy to assess and look at what maintaining that current level of service would mean. As part of this interim update, we're proposing that the proposed level of service continue to be that same approach, maintaining the current level of service, recognizing that obviously some of the assets will need to be looked at a little closer. For example, your bridge, you're required to do your OSIM updates every 2 years. That may have some more information that would kind of dictate what that proposed level of service is. For your roads, once again, you've done some work on those roads since that time of the 22 asset management plan. So we thought it was a reasonable assumption to continue, at least in the interim, to have the same language of maintaining that current level of service. What that means is, similar to the 22 asset management plan, we need to define a set of life cycle activities that would need to undertaken in order to undertake that work. The list here outlines kind of what those life cycle activities are. Non-infrastructure solutions, really minor component relating to actions or policies that lower costs or extend asset life. So anything outside of managing or maintaining the assets themselves would fall into non-infrastructure solutions. It's related to any work you're doing to manage those assets, updating your inventories, completing an asset management plan, and so on. The big ticket items are the next ones here, and you'll see a lot of those in the wedge there. In total, those total life cycle activities over a 40-year planning period, which is this consistent with the 22 asset management plan, is about $200 million. All this in constant $25. So $200 million over 40 years in order to maintain the assets. The biggest shares are really related to capital renewal and replacement. Those are related to the overall repair, rehabilitation, replacement of vehicles, repairing roads and maintaining them, and so on. That is the lion's share of the life cycle cost, making about 3/4 of that. Operations and maintenance, which are your regular maintenance activities, things like your kind of your gravel maintenance, things such as kind of maintaining your vehicles and so on, make up about 1/4 of that $200 million. The smallest shares here, the non-infrastructure solutions, like I mentioned, and then a provision for expansion activities. This is more of a high-level estimate in terms of putting a provision in there over such a long time period. There may be some expansionary or level of service changes that may be required. There isn't an exact science to that small gray wedge, but nonetheless, it's more of a best practice in order to account for costs that are not fully understood at this time. So that all that is still consistent with the approach in the 22 asset management plan. Looking at what that means in terms of the gap or the funding gap over that 40-year period. Once again, a very similar picture to what we saw in the 2022 asset management plan. So looking at that 40-year total, that's your $200 million in life cycle costs that we identified in the previous slide. What we want to do is we want to look at the funding and how that measures up against the costs that have been identified over that 40-year period. So the 40-year life cycle costs at $200 million. If we were to notionally maintain the current funding levels over that 40-year period, and the current funding levels are based on the 2025 budget, we would have about $68.8 million in funding out to that 40 years. That would still leave a gap. That gap would be about $130.4 million. What that means, and from a practical perspective, that's the do nothing approach. If we do nothing, we maintain our funding at the current levels with no funding increases or tax increases, we would have a gap of $130 million over that period. What that means is, that gap continues to grow. That's related to depreciation of assets deteriorating over the long term, and costs increasing in order to replace them as they get older. However, in the 22 AMP, there was a strategy 3 that was recommended to council. And what we did here is we wanted to measure that strategy 3 once again using our new or updated costs. Strategy 3, what it proposes is to increase funding in line with the increases in the previous budget. So increasing the funding to the asset management reserves based on sort of those historical increases. If we were to do that, it would be an increase in the tax levy of about $53,700 per year, every year over that 40-year period. What that means is that would generate about $41.9 million more over that 40-year period, reducing that gap to about $88.5 million. And that sort of funding would be consistent with the level of service that's being shown here in terms of maintaining those assets based on the current level of service or the current conditions as they are today. The what that means is 53,700 is about a 0.8% increase to the 25 tax levy of 7.1 million. Once again, consistent with strategy 3 of the 22 AMP. One more thing to note here, similar to what you saw in the replacement value a few slides ago, the life cycle costs have gone up to that same magnitude. As the replacement value goes up, the cost to maintain that infrastructure also continues to rise with inflation. That's what's happened since the 22 asset management plan. The life cycle costs have continued to go up. The magnitude of the gap continues to be similar. We have made adjustments to this gap to reduce it from the 22 AMP by some of the work that you've done on the road since that time of 2022. So we want to, while it's not exact, we want to make sure we recognize that you've done work since that time, and we want to make sure that this gap reflects that and there's downward pressure on that. Nonetheless, $88.5 million being a substantial gap over 40 years. But once again, similar to what we saw back in 2022, this is not uncommon for municipalities. These gaps continue to be quite significant, given the infrastructure needs for municipalities. Just to cap off a couple slides here, the approach is to close the gap. There are going to be numerous approaches to kind of address what that gap is over the long term. For the township, continuing to seek funding from upper levels of government, Obviously, being able to advocate for that funding, not always an easy thing to do. The government has their priorities, and obviously right now, housing is a big ticket item. A lot of that funding is being redirected to those kind of goals. Perhaps the township, if you're not seeing that level of growth, may not be able to take advantage of that, but nonetheless, keeping something in mind that you do still have costs that need to be undertaken that could be funded from other sources. Increased investment in infrastructure, kind of the what we saw here in terms of the strategy, in terms of increasing the tax levy over time in order to fund that gap. Improved data quality, always making sure that the inventories are up to date, making sure that conditions are up to date, because if we're able to have better data and better information on conditions, that usually has downward pressure on those costs. As we recognize, we move away from the age-based approach and we turn to a condition-based approach, which usually provides a better picture of the infrastructure. Thinking about the levels of service, once again, the 2026 update, the township is expected to kind of look at that in a little more detail. Looking at the levels of service in more detail may have an influence on what that gap looks like. Assessing risk tolerance, what sort of risk are we willing to accept in terms of that gap, and any project coordination that's possible with either neighboring municipalities or any other levels of government. Kind of a smaller part of it, but really something that could be looked at from this context. Just to finalize here, some next steps. The interim update here of the 25, for this 25 interim update, the township would need to append this to the 22 asset management plan to kind of fill in the gaps and the requirements of the regulation, at least in the interim. We want to continue, or we want the township to continue to update asset inventories with information on replacements, disposals, and conditions wherever possible. An important component. These asset management plans are data-heavy exercises. The better the data available, the better the more informed the result can be. And then the 26 update. We want to make sure that the township is looking at this full update, a review in detail of replacement costs and conditions, making sure that you're consulting with subject matter experts or staff in the township on the level of service and what the proposed level of service could be. We want to make sure that based on that, there's a recalculation of the funding gaps, what that could look like based on that consultation on the levels of service, and develop a financing strategy to meet those proposed levels of service in detail. So that said, the township, not the only one, you're not the only ones in sort of the situation that you are in terms of looking at data a little more deeply, but nonetheless, this interim update provides some guidance in order to get to that next step and do the detailed analysis on the level of service. With that ends my formal presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions from council.
Okay, thank you very much, Christopher. That was great information, and I really appreciate. I was looking through the slides and all your information there, and it talks about roads and bridge. I know you had it singular, which is good because we just have the one because of 6 inches. And it would have been a county asset rather than ours, but yeah, that's the bridge on Eels Lake Road. So it just made me laugh when I see it. It's roads and bridge. Anyway, council questions, comments. Jim, you start us off.
Hi, thanks very much for the report. I'd like to know, we have poor condition in here for $3 million and very poor condition for $3.5 million. What are those things that are in very poor condition? I haven't seen them.
We've hide them.
Hello?
Or through the
Yeah, he's looking. He's good.
Yeah, through the chair. So the assets that end up in those categories are vehicles, equipment, and some components of some of the facilities. However, the reason for that is because those assets are based on age. So what that means is because they were acquired many years ago and they're past their useful life from the desktop analysis, they end up in that particular category. What we would do is in order to be able to address that in the data is we need to kind of make sure that we've captured, number one, the inventory correctly, it's up to date. And number two, to make sure we update the conditions of those assets. Even if the data shows that the age or those assets are beyond their useful life, in the model that we developed for the township, we can override those conditions to make them reflect the conditions on the ground. So it's not any particular building as a whole that's in poor condition from the data. There's certain components that show that they're in poor condition just based on their age.
Okay, so for example, like the Glen Alda Community Center, that's a very old building, but we have done some renovations and updates and improvements to it, so that maybe is one of those, that's an example.
Poor.
No, but just because of the age, like it's a 100-year-old building, right? So I'm thinking that's automatically gonna trigger, you're very poor condition, cause you are ancient, right? But like you said, I get what he's saying, it's like if we're maintaining this older infrastructure, it's not being necessarily captured by this, but he just said that they can kind of tweak that when they get into the more detailed assessment.
We have, we have a schedule for replacing older vehicles and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
We do it all the time. Okay, it leads into my second question anyway, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead, absolutely.
We've showed that we have $106 million worth of assets. And in 40 years, it's gonna cost $40 million to keep them up. You're saying that we have to replace everything and some of them half again or twice again?
So the analysis
No,
look.
we only have $108 million and $106 million in assets. And he's saying that we need in 40 years, we need 200 million.
That's right.
So, you know, where does this gap lie that, we would cost us more to replace everything than it costs now? Or than it's worth now?
Yeah, I can answer that question. Yeah, so a lot of the largest costs in the analysis are really related to the roads. The information that came out of the roads needs study back in 2021 and 2022 provided a lot of the life cycle needs for those roads. So those roads, they generally have anywhere from kind of around that 30-year kind of useful life, not necessarily ripping up the road and replacing it, but repaving that road over that 30-year time frame. We base that information on what the engineers said in that particular report. So they follow a cycle, perhaps that's more aggressive than what's perhaps needed on the ground on the roads today, if they're in very good condition, but it reflects several cycles of repairs for those roads being kind of the biggest chunk of it. For the vehicles, equipment, and so on, once again, those are based on a cycle of replacements. There'd be several cycles, especially for vehicles, anywhere from 10 to 20-year useful life. 10 years, there'd be 4 cycles, 20 years, there'd be 2 cycles, at least in that 40-year timing, which reflects that. So in a way, the time period that we're looking at is not necessarily related to the life cycles of the assets, but more so we looked at, even from the 22 asset management plan, we looked at a longer time period in order to mitigate some of the tax increases that we've shown here. If we were to undertake the work as is without any modification from those roads needs studies, we would have substantial tax increases that would be unrealistic. So we extended a lot of those costs to a much longer time period.
And Judy says some information to add.
If I may, sorry, not to that point.
Yeah, but
just about the condition of the assets, and we are planning a roads needs study next year to get a better, so that we have that information for this update for the asset management plan. But also update the condition too, which will make a difference on the poor and very poor perhaps. So next year, it'll all come together with that information to have a more updated, accurate asset management plan.
Yeah, because in 2021, we had the roads need study, but we also then approved the 5-year surface treatment program, right? And so we are in the 3rd year of that, I believe. Are we second or third?
Third or fourth?
I think anyway, so yeah, and Christopher did make that point too, is that because of the work that we are undertaking, that's certainly going to have an impact.
It will reflect.
Yeah, but Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, that's my point. Over the 40 years, we're gonna be replacing all these things. So in 40 years, we don't need $200 million, because all of the money that we spend in the meantime, which isn't in what's the money in now that we're saving for this asset management? What's it in? Is it in a reserve?
Oh, sorry. Yes, it is.
So we should be spending that money in reserve and doing roads and buying more vehicles. Go ahead.
I got it, Judy, yes.
Yes, through you, Madam Mayor, and yes, that is council's decision. I think there's about 6 million in there at this point. And each year, the amount that we are transferring into that reserve, we can use some of that as well, which we have done in the past. But some way, but we also use some of it to fund some of our capital projects.
Okay, I just have trouble with $200 million in 40 years. It's just a gap I can't see, but I'm not a mathematician like Judy.
That's all right. I mean, and hopefully, I mean, the moves we make today will help to lessen that in the future, right? But Colin, you had your hand up.
Yeah, one, there's replacement as we go along, but plus
Yeah.
there's two other levels of government that often are helping us with these larger projects.
We hope.
Fingers crossed that we continue to have a good relationship with them. But I did have a couple more like technical type questions before
Sure.
getting into my thought. What is a non-infrastructure solution that we have $50,000 budgeted for from now until 64?
So the non-infrastructure solutions capture any activities related to managing the assets, but not necessarily work directly on the assets. So anything related to work on updating your inventories, doing an asset management plan, planning around infrastructure, anything that's related to kind of the indirect work in order to manage the assets overall for the township. That's a general provision. There isn't, once again, it's not an exact amount of money driven by any kind of any of the assets themselves, but it's generally good practice to have some funds or some costs in that bucket in order to be able to undertake any, once again, changes in legislation that may increase costs that may not be necessarily captured in the kind of the other life cycle activities. So a provisionary item overall.
Okay.
And then going to the next column, promise I won't go through every single one of them, but operations and maintenance, it's holding steady for 10 years and then it's starting to go up. Is that just based on this sort of theoretical process we're going through where we're not going to replace anything until 40 years from now?
Certainly, I can address that. So the operations and maintenance kind of two components. So to explain the first component, everything's in constant $25. So you'll see that line that kind of goes, that's kind of flat. We've gone through the budget and identify any asset management specific operations and maintenance costs. So we haven't included any costs associated to, say, staffing or operation or programming and things like that. Anything that's related to maintenance, we try to hive out of the budget as best we can. The increase is related. There's once again an expansionary component to it, a provisionary over that 40-year period. When we did the 22 asset management plan and we consulted with staff, there was an element of thinking about perhaps there's a need over a longer time period in order to make improvements to certain roads. It's largely related to the roads, whether they be level of service increases, traffic measures, or anything like that that wasn't captured through the roads need study at that time. So once again, it is a provisionary item. Thinking it's such a long time period, best practice is to kind of be a little more conservative on the cost side component. But once again, if we evaluate this and we say, well, actually, that's never going to happen, the township isn't growing at all over that 40-year period, perhaps it's something that could be tapered down. But that's kind of the background of why that's in there.
And then my final question here would be, how much confidence can we have in these 40-year figures? Because within the last 40 years, there's been a large number of unforeseen circumstances that have dramatically changed cost of replacement for these things. Like I imagine 2025 versus 22 versus the one before the pandemic, like each one individually would represent a significant jump. So how certain are we with these figures?
Certainly, by no means is this a crystal ball, or can we guess what's going to happen in 40 years? Ultimately, the analysis is based on the life cycle of assets. So a lot of the assets are quite long lived, particularly your roads, your facilities. In that interim period, there are elements of those assets that don't necessarily need to be replaced. To the point made earlier, your facilities are 50, 100 years old, but they're still there. They're still running. With good maintenance, those facilities can remain. So while we have included costs over 40 years, from the 22 analysis, we did taper down those costs a little bit to recognize that there are components that need to be repaired as opposed to being replaced. So over the short term, once again, at that time, the shorter term kind of analysis, kind of the 5 to 10 year, the 5 year being a little more certain. We kind of know where the backlogs are of the work that needs to be done. The 10 year, a little less certain. Beyond the 10 and forward, we'll generally say that is just based on desktop analysis. And that's really the kind of the reality of these types of analyses.
Perfect, thank you.
All right, any other questions or comments? Just looking to staff, like we're looking to receive this for today because we're still having like our capital forecast as well as budget, at which point we'll be making that decision, right? Judy?
Yes, and I think it addresses that in the motion,
Oh, there was a motion that was sent, wasn't there?
the recommended motion.
Connie, you're so good. I gotta find it now. Hang on a second. Yeah, Connie, you did email and I'm looking
I can
for,
read it out.
oh, that would be great if you could do that because you're faster.
Yeah, so this was a recommendation from the treasurer that council received the asset management plan update presentation from Christopher Vallette of Hemson Consulting. And further that council consider the funding strategy in table B2 of the 2025 interim update to the asset management plan for the 2026 budget, which is consistent with strategy 3 of the 2022 asset management plan. And further that the 2025 interim update be appended to the existing asset management plan. And further that a detailed update of the asset management plan be completed in 2026 to look at the proposed level of service in detail and determine a financing strategy to meet the proposed level of service if changes are warranted.
Okay, that's quite a
So,
motion. Who would like to make that motion? Jim O'Shea will make
Jim
it.
O'Shea.
I heard it come right out of his lips. And
It's on the tip of his tongue.
seconded by Colin. All those in favor? That is approved. Thanks very much, Christopher. Appreciate you taking the time and explaining all of this. And yeah, we'll see what we end up deciding for budget. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, so now I need to get back. Where are we again? Oh. Matt sneaking in. So that was it. We're going right back down now to, we're in closed session, correct? Okay,
As far as I can see.
that's where we are. Okay, so I need a motion for us.
Maybe, I think that.
Oh, pardon me. Here. We'll be going into closed session here shortly, but
Oh, so we want to.
just gonna wait.
Did where this nice Japanese maple on my desktop is.
What do you got? What do you got?
Pictures on it.
It changes everything.
Oh.
Yeah.
Somewhere in the mountains,
So we're okay. It's AI.
Argentina.
Ooh, okay.
Sorry about that.
That's
No,
okay. We're okay to go now? Okay. All right, so I need a motion for us to go into closed session pursuant to section 239(2) of the Municipal Act, as we are dealing with matters, personnel matters, but an identified individual, specifically talking about the compensation review and succession planning. So motion for that, please. Moved by Ruth Ann, seconded by Jim Whale. All those in favor? We are going into close. Thank you.